WorldComEDU. Elite Children's Classics.
Davy Crockett. Do you know Davy Crockett? Davy Crockett was a real person in American history, but he is considered a legendary person. He is one of the greatest heroes of America. Have you ever heard about the Battle of the Alamo? In the battle, Davy Crockett was killed while he was defending a fort within the town of San Antonio in Texas. The Battle of the Alamo was the battle for Texas independence from Mexico. In those days, Texas was a part of Mexico. In 1820, Moses Austin became interested in this new land and received permission from the Mexican government to settle 300 American families there. Moses Austin died the next year, but his son, Stephen Fuller Austin, carried out his father's plan. The success of Austin's settlements attracted other Americans, until there were about 30,000 Americans living in Texas within 10 years. But the Mexican population of Texas was still only about 3,000, even after 300 years. The Mexican government became worried because of the large number of foreigners living in Texas. After 1830, Mexico closed the doors to any new Americans who wished to settle there. The government ordered them to pay taxes. They were not permitted to have slaves, even though many of them came from the South with their slaves. The settlers considered these measures unfair, but the Mexican government sent troops into Texas to bring the settlers under control. Then the battle broke out. In this famous Battle of the Alamo, 183 Americans were killed. Davy Crockett was among them. He was known as a frontiersman from the state of Tennessee. He came to Texas to help the Texans fight against Mexico. Davy went to Texas in 1834. He thought that the new land of Texas would need him. Davy's trip was almost a pleasure trip. But when he got to San Antonio, the situation was a little different. The Mexican general Santa Anna was coming from the south with more than 2,000 troops, so Davy had to go out as a leader of a scouting party as soon as he got there. He discovered the Mexicans about 20 miles away. Davy ran back to San Antonio to tell the defenders of the town about it. The defenders were in a fort, the Alamo. The Alamo had been part of an old Spanish church many years before. About 150 men were defending the fort. The Alamo was the first defense against the Mexicans. Later, a group of volunteers joined the defenders. Then there were about 183 men defending the fort. A meeting was held to decide whether to hold the fort or escape while there was still time. The defenders decided to stay there and fight against the Mexicans. No one chose to leave. On February 24th, before the Mexicans began to attack the fort, a polite note was first sent to Colonel Travis. He was the leader of the Texans. The note demanded that the fort should be surrendered. The note said, "Otherwise, the fort will be blown to pieces." But the defenders answered, "No surrender." The big guns of the Mexicans began to sound. The defenders of the Alamo fought bravely. The walls of the Alamo were thick, but as time passed, the Mexicans showed their strength. Colonel Travis fell ill. Colonel Jim Bowie, another famous Western character of the period, was also too sick to lead the men. Crockett was asked to be the leader of the defenders of the fort, but he refused. He said, "That's not necessary. All hands are doing as well as they can." But the situation became serious by the 10th day. The Texans got sick, because they couldn't sleep. The Mexican attack continued, and many men in the fort were dead or dying. There was little ammunition left. Messages asking for help were sent out to the towns nearby, but no one arrived to help them. Escape was still possible, and the men were asked if they wished to leave. No one wanted to do so. Outside the fort, Santa Anna prepared for the final attack. On the afternoon of March 5th, the fighting slowed down and almost stopped. But during the night, the men could hear the enemy getting ready. Orders were shouted. A great number of troops, horses, and cannons were moving about. The attack began at about 4 o'clock in the morning of March 6th. A lot of Mexican troops advanced toward the fort. Ladders were brought up, and Mexicans began to climb the walls. Hundreds of men on the ladders were shot down, but others soon took their places on the ladders. Some of the Mexicans began to break down the heavy front gate of the fort. Soon they streamed into the fort. The defenders were driven back into the central court of the fort. Gunfire was of no use now. The men used their rifles as clubs. Davy Crockett was among them. He drew his hunting knife and fought on bravely, but it was of no use. At last, Davy was killed. No American tried to run away. Not one was left alive. The Alamo fell. The Alamo is now preserved by Texas as a state park. In front of the old fort, there is a monument to the heroes who died there. If you stand before the monument, perhaps you'll remember the name of Davy Crockett. Some people say Davy Crockett was the king of the wild frontier. It is also said that he killed a bear when he was only 7 years old. Davy Crockett was born on August 17, 1786, in eastern Tennessee. About the time when Davy was born, his grandfather was killed by Indians. His father was a poor tavern owner. He had lots of children to care for. When Davy became 12 years old, his father made him go to a nearby farm and made him work there in order to pay his father's debts. Davy didn't like farming or working for other men. He didn't like school either. But when he was 14, his father decided to send him to school. At school, he was often beaten by the bigger boys, so he didn't want to go to school anymore. His father whipped him with a big stick to make him go to school. Davy couldn't stand that. He left home without saying a word and didn't come back for 3 years. After a lot of hard jobs, Davy went back home. He worked again on other people's farms. Then he began to love a young woman who lived nearby. He made up his mind to marry her. But she married someone else. He was heartbroken. Soon he found another young woman and married her. He bought a small piece of land and began to farm. He liked hunting better than farming, so he spent most of the time in the fields and forests. He learned the ways of birds and animals from morning till night. He could imitate them so well that they would come when he made their calls from some hiding place. The wild turkey is a very careful bird, but Davy would make the male turkey think a female turkey was waiting for him. When the male turkey came near him, Davy would shoot it. He seldom missed. Davy liked to hunt for bears best of all. One day when he heard some of his dogs barking in the distance, he followed the sound of the dogs. He stumbled, fell in a small river, and climbed through the bush blindly. Finally, he reached the tree which the bear had climbed, but he couldn't see the bear easily, for it was getting dark. He shot a few times, but the bear didn't come down. All at once the bear jumped onto the ground. The dogs chased it and made it go into a narrow ditch. Davy was afraid to shoot his dogs, so he jumped into the ditch. While the dogs were barking, clawing, and biting the bear, Davy plunged his knife into its heart. Davy was a good hunter and a good shot, but he tried not to use his gun too much when he went hunting. When someone asked the reason, he would answer, "Sometimes I just grin a raccoon out of a tree and hug it to death." When the listener didn't believe him, he would continue, It's true, I often grin so hard at the raccoons that they just come right out of the trees. One day, I saw a raccoon up in a tree at dusk. I began grinning at him and he grinned back. I kept grinning, but it didn't do any good. So I climbed up the tree a little way and grinned again. I thought that this raccoon was tough, as it could resist my grinning. Then I climbed higher, until I looked at it directly in the face. That wasn't a raccoon after all, it was just a big knot up on the branch. As I continued grinning hard, the knot came loose and was ready to fall. The story shows you he was not only a courageous man, but also a humorous one, so he was loved by a lot of Americans. Later, Crockett moved his family farther west. Davy's nearest neighbor lived 7 miles away. Davy lived happily because there were a lot of wild animals in the forests. Bears were everywhere. He killed as many as 105 bears a year. He became the greatest bear hunter of Tennessee. Many people who were going down the Mississippi River dropped in to see the famous hunter. At last, he was appointed colonel in the state militia and a judge in the local court. Then he was elected a member of the United States Congress in Washington. But in the elections of 1834, he was defeated. After that, he left for Texas and the Battle of the Alamo. The smallest hut in the world. Long, long ago, there lived a selfish old farmer and his wife in the smallest hut in the world. The hut had only one room. It was so small that they could have only the most necessary things: a bed, a table, and a cupboard. The old man never entertained anyone, so he did not find it necessary to have any other furniture. One day the farmer received a letter from his daughter. She asked in the letter if she, her husband, and their little baby could come and stay with her old parents. And she said that her husband had lost his job, and that they were getting poorer day by day. "Enough!" cried the old man. "I'll hear no more about it. We cannot give them food and a bed." The wife was disappointed to hear that. Nothing would move the selfish old man. Soon, however, another letter came. The poor mother could not bear to tell her daughter not to come. "What bad parents we are! We cannot even help our own children," she said. "Let's stop discussing it," said the old farmer. "Instead, let's follow the wise man's advice." In the village, there was no judge or policeman. The people were governed by the wise man. So the next morning, the selfish farmer left for the wise man's house. After a long walk, he reached it and stood at the door. The wise man was sitting in front of the fire. He was reading a book. "What's the matter with you? Come in, my friend," said the wise man. "I'm in trouble, sir," said the farmer. "Our daughter and her lazy husband and their baby want to come to my hut and live with us. My hut is too small." "What shall I do?" asked the farmer. The wise man looked at him for a few minutes and said, "Let your daughter and her husband and their little baby stay with you." The old farmer couldn't believe his ears, and he went back home with a heavy heart. That night he wrote his daughter, and a few days later all three arrived. The young husband gathered soft straw and made a bed on the floor for the old parents. He got up early every morning and worked all day long in the forest and fields. The daughter cooked and cleaned the hut and took care of the baby. The old man had nothing to do but complained all day, and at last he went to the wise man's house again. "What's the matter?" the wise man asked him. "How unhappy I am! Please help me. My hut is very noisy, and I cannot sleep. I don't want to live with them." The wise man thought for a minute and said, "Tell me, do you have any chickens?" "Oh, yes," said the farmer.
I have 6 chickens.
Take the chickens into the hut, said the wise man. The farmer went back home without saying a word. That night, the farmer took the chickens into his hut. The next day, the old farmer went to the wise man's house again.
My hut has become noisier than before. Please help me,
he said to the wise man. The wise man thought for a moment and asked him,
Do you have a goat?
Oh, yes, said the farmer.
Well then, take the goat into the hut,
said the wise man. The old man could not believe his ears and went back home without a word. That night he took the goat into the hut. The next day the old farmer went to the wise man again.
My hut has become noisier and dirtier than before. Please help me,
the old man said to the wise man. The wise man thought for a few minutes and said at last,
Do you have a pig?
That night a pig was taken into the old man's hut. And the next day a donkey and a cow were taken into his small hut, a lamb and a goose too. At last his small hut was crowded with many animals. The poor old farmer couldn't sleep at all. He went to the wise man's house and said, crying to him,
Oh, help me! I can't rest. I'll die soon. Please give me your advice, wise man.
Well, said the wise man, smiling,
one must not expect too much at one time. Let me see.
He thought for a minute and said,
Let the chickens out of the hut.
Thank you, cried the farmer and hurried home. That night he was very happy without the chickens, but his happiness didn't last long, for the other animals began to make louder noises than before. They were sorry to lose their friends, the chickens. Once again, the old farmer went to the wise man's house. The wise man smiled when he heard the farmer's story.
Yes. We must find a way to make your hut quiet. You had better take the goat and the pig out of the hut, said the wise man. The farmer went home with delight, and that night the goat and the pig returned to their own places outside. The hut became very clean and quiet. But soon the lamb began to cry. It wanted to see its best friend, the goat. The poor lamb cried from morning till night, looking for the goat. Go to the wise man for his advice, the farmer's wife said at last. So he went to the wise man again and explained about the poor lamb. The wise man advised him to let the lamb out. But the farmer forgot about the donkey. The donkey liked the lamb very much. They were very good friends. As soon as the lamb was out, the donkey began to cry very hard. So once again, he went back to the wise man and said to him, May I let the donkey out of the hut? The next day he let the donkey out of the hut, under the direction of the wise man, and the next day he let the cow out of the hut. At last he became quite happy and said, How quiet my hut is! How big it seems to me today! It isn't the smallest hut in the world. At last happiness came to the poor old man's family. The young husband got up very early and softly went out of the hut to work in the fields, and the old man slept quite well on his nice warm bed of straw. When he awoke, his wife and daughter got breakfast ready for him, and his little grandson filled the hut with smiles like sunshine. The old man remembered his lonely life before his daughter's family came to his hut. He did not want to let his daughter's family go, so he stood in front of the house of the wise man again. What's the matter?
asked the wise man.
At last, I have found peace thanks to your advice, and I have come to thank you for teaching me how to live, said the old farmer. But how about your daughter and her family? You said there was no room in your little hut for them. You had better send them away, said the wise man.
"Oh no!" cried the old farmer. The wise man watched the old farmer's face for a long time, smiling happily. The Man Who Kept House. Once upon a time, there was a farmer who believed that his work was too hard. Each evening when he returned from his fields, he would ask his wife what she did all day. "I kept house," she always answered. The farmer would say, "Oh, your work is easy. I wish I had nothing to do but churn the butter, cook supper, and watch the baby." One evening, the man's wife grew tired of hearing about her easy work, so she said, "Tomorrow I'll work in the fields, and I want you to keep house."
"Fine," said the man. "Keeping house will be no trouble at all for me."
The next morning his wife went straight to the fields, while the farmer started to do the housework. First he filled the churn with cream to make butter. Suddenly he remembered, "I haven't seen the baby since my wife left. Something terrible may have happened to our baby." But the baby was only playing in the garden. The man caught her up in his arms and returned to the house. Beside the churn stood a pig. It knocked over the churn and began to drink the spilled cream.
"This is terrible,"
said the man as he picked up the churn. Stamping his foot, the farmer roared at the pig. He chased it outside and put more cream in the churn. Suddenly he remembered,
"I have not yet taken water to the cow. This is terrible."
The man put the baby to bed and went off to draw water from the well. But he came back to get the churn. He couldn't take a chance on leaving it where the pig might knock it over again. With the churn under one arm, the man stamped down the path to the well. He leaned over to get the rope that hung in the well. As he leaned over, the cream spilled straight into the well below. The angry farmer put down the churn and grabbed the rope. Then he began to draw up water for the cow. After his cow had had enough to drink, he started to take her to a grassy field. Suddenly, he remembered that the baby was sleeping in the house.
"This is terrible," cried the poor farmer. "The baby should not be left alone. What shall I do with the cow?"
The man looked at the tall grass that grew on the roof of his house. How he wished his cow had wings! Then she could fly up there and eat the grass. All at once he thought of a way to get the cow up on the roof.
"I will make a bridge for her,"
he said to himself. First he led the animal to the top of a small hill behind the house. Then he got a long, wide board and placed it from the hilltop to the roof. After that, he led the cow across the bridge onto the roof. The man returned to the kitchen. When he was getting more cream to churn, he suddenly remembered that he had to cook dinner. He filled a large pot with water and put it in the fireplace to warm. Just then the poor man remembered the cow on the roof above.
"Oh, this is terrible," he cried. "The cow might fall and hurt herself."
Quickly he ran outside and got a long rope. He crossed the board to the roof and tied one end of the rope around the cow's horns. The other end of the rope he dropped down the chimney. Then the man came back into the house. He ran to the chimney and caught hold of the rope. After drawing it down into the room, he tied it around his boot top. "There," he said, stamping his foot, "the cow can't fall off the roof and hurt herself. Now I can cook dinner." At that moment, the cow went sliding off the roof. As she fell, the rope began drawing the man up the chimney. There outside the house was the cow hanging by the rope on her horns. There in the chimney was the poor man hanging upside down by the rope on his foot. He was right above the pot of warm water. The man could not help himself. He could not get up the chimney. He could not get down. He could only roar in a gruff voice. When the man's wife came back from the fields, she saw the cow hanging from the roof. She quickly cut the rope and let the poor cow down. At that very second, the wife heard a splash in the house. She ran in and saw the farmer with his legs up the chimney and his head in the cooking pot. All the water had splashed out over the floor. The wife helped the man out of the pot. Then she cleaned the house, churned the butter, and cooked some food. While his wife worked, the man leaned back in his chair. Never again did he offer to keep house.